Well, with that, then let me introduce, please, to you Mr. Jeff Cathy, a naval aviator with 29 years of service, with commands including 2 fleet squadrons and a carrier wing. Jeff is a veteran of 100 combat missions in Operation Urgent Fury, Operation Enduring Freedom, and Operation Iraqi Freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, it is truly my pleasure and my honor to introduce to you Mr. Jeff Cathy.
Okay, well, I don't have any jokes that are clean enough to tell this group, but I met a few of you last night, and as we wait for the other fantastic people to come out here tonight, I just let me express my gratitude for all the midshipmen, all the cadets, the American Veterans Center, the archivists. I asked a gentleman that was up here earlier, I said, "Are you with the National Archives?" He goes, "I am the National Archives." I am the archivist, archivist. And so that was pretty special to meet him in this fantastic place. So the other legends of the air are just arriving. If Secretary of Defense comes later on, we'll just, we'll space A him and bring him in and accommodate former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel appropriately for sure. It's interesting is I heard that first panel and met Don Irwin and some of the fantastic people last night as we were trying to make our way to the chow hall with all the midshipmen and cadets and all of you that put a perimeter around the table and made us fight for our food last night. We appreciate that very much. But that was great. And I was thinking about the all-volunteer force and when did the draft end? There you go, bingo, 100 points for 1973. And so really so do the math, 45 years ago, right? And so that shift, I think the gentleman on the end of the first panel talked about, how did you enter the service? And back then it was called a draft, but he said it was a drift. And so however you get in, and I was talking to the archivist, and he was a Navy corpsman, and just the mere presence of a draft, some might call it the threat of a draft, brings in 4 times as many volunteers as draftees, and so that's pretty neat. So I guess that speaks as a testament to wanting to control your own destiny, right? All right, so we've got everybody, I think, right? Okay. Well, let's say, am I still on and on and on? Sound check is good as we move from podium to a very comfortable chair, gentlemen. Yeah. And as you can see, and let me just reassure everybody in here that this panel is aptly named as Legends of the Air. And my God, I'd read their backgrounds and read about them, and just had the pleasure of making an introduction just a few moments ago, and it would be my dream to have all these gentlemen as my wingmen anywhere, anytime, in some other generation. But my name is Jeff Cathy, former naval aviator, and this morning we are really truly in among legends, and I mean legends with a capital L. And because of these gentlemen's their deeds and their bravery really allows us to sit here in the nation's capital, in the National Archives, in an open forum, and discuss hot wars such as in Germany and Japan and Vietnam, and guerrilla wars in Venezuela and other locations, and Cold Wars, and Cuba and Russia. And while Americans, this country's relationships with those countries has changed dramatically since the early 40s and up to the late 60s, what has not changed is our respect and our admiration and our gratitude for these men and their extraordinary service. So, as I said, up until about Friday, I thought I was semi-cool, and until I read their biographies, and to to see what these men did when the nation called in the 20th century is extraordinary. So let's meet them now. Let's do that, and I'll make a short intro, and then the floor will certainly be theirs. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole, port side here. Sir, it's a very much of a pleasure to have you. Born in Dayton and completed 2 years of Ohio University before enlisting as a flying cadet in November of 1940. He's completed his training in July of 1941 and was a co-pilot for Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle on the very first airplane off the carrier USS Hornet headed for Tokyo in April of 1942. And after that unprecedented raid, he remained in the Chinese Burma-India theater until June of 1943, flying cargo from India to China. He flew with the Army Air Force's famed 1st Air Commandos in support of Allied operations behind Japanese enemy lines. And he had several operational assignments, including operations advisor to the Venezuelan Air Force before retiring to Texas in 1967. So big hand for Lieutenant Colonel Cole. Next on my starboard side here is Commander Dean, call sign Diz Laird, and the one and only Navy ace who achieved air victories against German and Japanese enemy planes during World War II. He's qualified in 100 different types of aircraft, right? My introduction, I think, was 100 combat missions or something like 100 different types of aircraft. Okay, so that's a big pause right there. And he served in 3 wars and choreographed and led the second attack on Pearl Harbor in 1969 in the movie, 20th Century Fox's movie, Tora, Tora, Tora. He enlisted in the Navy right after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and once deployed, Diz flew 175 combat and training missions. He served on 12 different aircraft carriers. How many are in the inventory today? In the whole inventory today? 11? And he transitioned to jets in 1947. He's the first person to land one on board USS Midway, and he has the most arrested landings, known as traps, on a straight deck aircraft carrier. His accumulated military flight time is 8,285 hours while making 520 carrier landings. And he says he never bolted. Diz is a recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross, as evidenced by the great lid that he has on this morning, the Meritorious Service Medal, the Air Medal, with 3 gold stars and 2 Presidential Unit citations, and a big hand for Commander Laird. By the way, this is a bolo tie. You can't make it out, even if you have x-ray vision from way back there, but the bolo tie on the top is an airplane coming head on, and I asked him what it was, and it's a Japanese Zero, and I'm sure he's going to regale us with a couple of stories there during this panel. Colonel Felix Rodriguez was recruited by the CIA following the Communist Revolution in his native Cuba. Infiltrated into Cuba in advance of the Bay of Pigs invasion, he would escape as a political exile following the invasion's failure. Returning to the United States, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army, not during President Kennedy's administration, but by President Kennedy. In 1967 and 68, he served as an advisor in Bolivia and was part of the effort to capture the famed revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara. From 1970 to 72, he served in Vietnam as an advisor for Provisional Reconnaissance Unit in country, and his awards include the Intelligence Star for Valor by the CIA, 9 awards of the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry, and the Vietnamese Naval Medal of Honor. He became a U.S. citizen in 1969. Soon enlisting in the United States Army in the Vietnam War, Rodriguez flew over 300 helicopter missions, mostly identifying Viet Cong hideouts with smoke charges, and these missions were, of course, of considerable risk. He was shot down 5 times. So, sir, I guess you too are an ace. That's pretty awesome. So, hey, let's get to know these gentlemen a little bit better right now, and I'll start it off with a few questions and see what we've got. Colonel, again, what an honor, what a pleasure. And let me ask you this. So, you know, the conventional way to launch off of an aircraft carrier is with a catapult. And yet you made a deck run, and the deck runs even back then were with smaller, lighter airplanes, right? on that April day in 1942. What made you and your crew think that you could launch a big, heavy B-25 bomber laden with bombs and full of fuel off of an aircraft carrier?
Well, to go back a little bit, the thought of taking an Army aircraft off of a Navy carrier was thought up by Admiral Lowe, or Captain Lowe, who was a submariner. He happened to be in an airplane and saw an Army bomber take off at Norfolk. And the idea hit him. He passed it up to the chain of command, and Roosevelt said, "Do it," because he was tired of badgering the Navy and the Army Air Corps about doing something after the Japanese did their attack. It happened that the Hornet at that time was on, I believe it was maiden vision out in the Atlantic, and to see if the idea was feasible or not, they put two carriers, or two B-25s on the carrier and went to sea. They were taken off successfully, and that helped the idea that it could be possible. And as a result of it, the whole mission was set up, and the idea of the mission was, number one, to prove to the Japanese that their island could be struck by air. And the other reason was for morale purposes of the U.S. and the Allies.
So really strategically and tactically was that mission. And, you know, listen to that first panel about a divine wind. And you know, so wind over the deck.
Yes.
And I know as you launched, the weather was a major factor in the procession of the mission. So, and you mentioned that, sir. So the signal that was sent of strength and reach and resolve that the Doolittle Raid, the Tokyo Raid achieved had a real impact on the Japanese military, according to the history books, and their leadership, and may have led them to overstretch down to the Midway Islands, where they suffered some pretty heavy losses. So the question is, what odds did you were all volunteer and you could back out if you didn't want to go, as we understand, and there were several crews that were qualified to go, but what odds did you and Colonel Doolittle and the Navy and the Army Air Forces give to those 16 bombers running that successful mission up to the Tokyo and the environs of Tokyo to include a safe landing?
Well, we didn't look at it from the odds. Colonel Doolittle developed his plan, and we went from there.
Right.
And it turned out that, like you have known now, that it was successful.
So I guess the odds makers are the commanders and the authority to authorize and order the mission to be conducted.
Well, I don't normally figure things in the odds deal, but I had pretty good odds of being able to fly with the best pilot.
Indeed, that certainly helps. Well, let's transition over to Commander Diz Laird, and as we know, it's in the papers here recently that the Navy is back in Norway, right? Took about 30 years off, and we're back up there in the Vesta Fjords. And you had your first and second air-to-air kill on the same day in the Norwegian Sea 75 years ago against German bombers, and that was in an F-4F Wildcat, and right?
Right.
And then a year later, you were in a different theater, and over by the Philippines and over in the Pacific in a different airplane. So I don't know if that was airplane number 2 or you're already up to like 22 by then, but an F-6F Hellcat, and you shot down some Japanese airplanes. This is perfect, as they were on a takeoff roll. So they're, you know, got the game face on, they got fuel, and they're all weaponed up and everything. And Diz Laird did not let them break the surly bonds. And you became an ace later on, and signifying ace is the 5 air-to-air kills. And Dick, Commander Laird, you summed up your distinguished career by saying, speed and altitude, have an advantage in both and never trade one without gaining in the other. And so my question, Commander, is what advantage did you have as you look back on it over the years to become an ace? Was it the equipment? Was it the training? Was it the physical prowess? Was it 20/20 vision? Was it a little bit of luck? What was it?
Probably a lot of all of that. The one thing I did, I had 20/10 vision, and I could spot airplanes long before anybody else ever did. This gave me an advantage over my buddies because they couldn't see what I could see, and also over the enemy because most of them I don't think had 20/10 vision. And I credit my vision for a lot of my success. Over off the coast of Norway in 1943, I was on a combat air patrol off the ship and relieving another one that had been out, and the fighter director officer had a target on his screen for some period of time, and the group ahead of us never could find it. Of course, the weather was kind of crummy, many clouds, and visibility not too great. So they were getting low on fuel, and we were launched to relieve them. And we went out in the same area where they had been, and we couldn't find anything either. So they gave us a vector back to the ship, and as we were leaving that area, I recalled that this fighter director officer was one of the best I'd ever seen and or worked with. And if he said there was a target out there, a live target, there was a target there. So as we left, unfortunately, they told us buster, which means full speed. And unfortunately, the airplane I had wouldn't keep up with the other 3. And well, we were spread out like this instead of in a finger formation. And I was tail end Charlie, way back. And so I kept thinking about the target back there, and I kept looking back just where we came from to see if anything showed up. And sure enough, I saw this airplane come out from behind this big cloud, and I didn't recognize it immediately as what kind, but I knew it wasn't one of ours because it had too many engines, and it went around in front of this big cloud and disappeared around the back. And in the meantime, of course, I had called tally-ho, bogey at 6 o'clock, and we all turned around. But when we turned around, of course, I was out in the front, and my section leader had a much better speed than I did, and he passed me, and we got up to the ship, and the airplane had gone around that big cloud and come out again on the same side he emerged from in the beginning. And so my section leader, I call him Boyd, that was his name. Boyd pulled up to get on the one side of him and to get in a position to make a good run. It was about the time we spotted him, he apparently saw us, and he turned south, which from this direction was like that, and which was the side I was on. Boyd got up in position to make his run, and I climbed up to get a position on this side. The plane was it was a Junkers 88, which I guess is probably equivalent to our B-17 in the German Luftwaffe. So he turned and headed south, and we started getting into position to make runs on it. By the time I got up here, Boyd was turning to come in on the first run he had, and he broke off. I came in from this side. When I finished out, we had him smoking, not badly, but we knew there was some damage. And Boyd, in the meantime, had gotten up here as I recovered, and he came in on another run. And as I was sitting up here, I thought, it had been what little experience I had, that most aircraft manufacturers would build fuel tanks in the wing stub of airplanes right where they joined the fuselage. And I thought that would be a primary place to aim your guns, and hopefully you hit them. So this time I came down and I aimed it right there, and I watched my tracers, and they hit right where I was aiming, and the airplane just exploded in a huge ball of fire. And I spent the next quite a few seconds dodging parts of airplane that were flying through the sky. And he was gone, just a few fragments falling into the water. So that was the end of the Ju-88. So we all rendezvoused again and headed back where we were going in the first place. So we got out there, and they gave us another vector down to this, more to the east. And as we were going again, we got all spread out again. And the leader, we came to a wall of water. It was rain coming down, and it was almost black on the other side of the front of it. And so the leader got up there, and he turned and paralleled the line of rain, and his wingman followed him, and the third one followed him. And about that time, I came up and I saw this, looked more like a shadow than anything else, but it was an airplane of, I'd estimate maybe 100 feet off the water, inside the rain squall, and he was heading in the opposite direction. And I tally-hoed him, and I went into the rain squall, and I went in about the distance I thought he might be. Because of the rain, I didn't have very good depth perception, of course. And I turned, headed south, which was where he was headed. And of course, he was quite a ways ahead of me, I guess, because I lost sight of him almost only seconds after I had first seen him. I don't know what the other guys were doing in the meantime. They were going the other direction. But Then I found out later they turned and headed south also, but I never saw them again for quite a while. And anyway, I had everything I had forward: power, throttle, gas, prop, going as fast as I could. And the Wildcat was not a great airplane. It was a great airplane about 1937, but 1943 it wasn't quite so great in comparison to others. And so I was going as fast as I could, I had read that the Wildcat would do somewhere around 300 to 310 knots max speed. So I wasn't indicating that much, but I had everything forward, and I knew I was going as fast as I could. And I picked an altitude that I guessed that airplane had been when he was heading south, and I stayed as low as I had to get pretty low because I wanted to keep my eye on the ocean, because that was my only visible reference to which way was up and which way was down, and I needed something to show me where the water was so I wouldn't run into it. And so I'm steaming along there as fast as I can. I'm scanning ahead, trying to see if I can find that airplane that went by us, and all of a sudden, out of about 11:30 position to me, I'm here like this. Here's an airplane staring me almost in the eye and going in the opposite direction. Well, I just automatically pulled up, squeezed the trigger. I was hoping to hit. He was about 11:30 position, so he was off a little to my left. I saw immediately he was a twin-engine airplane, had a boat-type hull, so it was a seaplane, and had twin engines. And I was lined up with the port, and for you Air Force types, that's the left-hand side. The port engine, I pulled up and I squeezed the trigger, but I never got up to the engine. Right below the engine, suspended there, was a big float, a landing float for landing on water. It had them on each wing, suspended underneath the two engines. And I never got quite to the engines when I pulled the trigger, but I smashed the heck out of this port side float. And it was, I don't know if pilot hid the airplane. The airplane was a Heinkel 115, I learned later. But I don't know if the pilot knew that I had smashed that float or not. But anyway, then I had to duck because I don't know how close, but I think I came at least that close to smashing into the enemy airplane head on. And then I turned as fast as I could to get behind him. Well, by that time I got turned 180 degrees. He was well out of my 50 caliber range, although I tried a couple to see what kind of range I had, and my bullets would go, well, they were good for a good 1,000 feet, and they'd get up there and the tracers would burn out, and you could see the little smoke trails as they would fall below the target. And I never gained on him. I had full speed, and this guy was, I'm sure he was at full speed also, and which was someplace around 300 to 310 knots. And finally, I thought, what are we? I'm not catching him. I got to do something. And I thought, I wonder if I just lobbed some up there this way, I might get some hits. I knew that our normal firing of the 50 calibers at 1,000 feet, you had a bullet drop of about a foot or more, and if you aimed here, your bullets were going to go down here. So I thought, no, I don't know whether I know I'm more than 1,000 feet out behind him, and I think I must be close to 2,000 feet. I could be 2,500 feet, and I thought, at that range, I probably have a bullet drop of perhaps 10, maybe even 12 feet. But it'd be worth a try just to give it a shot. So I pulled up and aimed about 10 or 12 feet over the top of this guy and let fire, and I watched the bullets go up and they started to drop. I couldn't tell whether they hit him or not. And the tracers had all burned out and everything, so but all of a sudden, he dumped his nose, went down close to the water and rotated to land, and he touched down, and that float on his port wing underneath his engine there didn't hold up because it was so badly damaged. It dug into the water, pulled his left wing down, it dug into the water, and the airplane did a beautiful cartwheel right in front of me, and with pieces flying off it and wings coming apart and the fuselage and everything else. And ended up in a big mess on the ocean. And I was there in just a matter of a few seconds, and I went around, I went let down to about 2 or 3 feet off the water, and just look at the wreckage, and here over on one side, 3 crewmen were in the water. And so I went around them like this and looked at them, and they all seemed to be healthy. They were waving at me, so I gave them a salute and went on around and again, and about then my leader showed up. I didn't see him, but I could hear him. He called home base and said, we got 3 survivors in the water. How about sending a destroyer over and picking them up? Well, we were probably 75 or 100 miles from the fleet by then, and these guys didn't have a chance. That water was so cold that I'd say they'd all be dead within 20 minutes or 25 minutes from hypothermia. That would have been an effort in uselessness, really, to try to come over and pick them up. They turned us down anyway, so we rendezvoused and went on home.
Wow.
But that was the only air combat that we had the whole 6 or 8 months we were over there. The only 2 airplanes we saw, enemy airplanes, and I was just lucky enough that I found them both.
Wow, all on the same day, really. So it is the speed and altitude, X-ray vision, a little luck with the 50 cal, and it was very encouraging to see you talk with your hands right away, sir. I got right into the shoot the watch thing. So that was an awesome story to
I've had
spell.
I've had a lot of practice.
A lot of practice. That's awesome. Well, let's transition over to Colonel Rodriguez. And sir, you left Cuba when Fidel Castro took over, several years later in 1959, and went in for what's considered a failed operation at the Bay of Pigs. And Castro himself took over command of that military operation, prevailed. But is your thought, looking back on it, is that invasion under John F. Kennedy always thought to be an American loss, or did it strengthen America's resolve in there and into South America later on and other places as the communist threat expanded?
Well, the operation was started by President Eisenhower, and it was supposed to be completely different. It wasn't supposed to be an invasion at all. When President Eisenhower was briefed by the intelligence service in 1960 that the Soviets were going to bring offensive missiles into Cuba, that's when they ordered the CIA to destabilize the Castro regime. And the idea was a guerrilla warfare in the mountains of the Escambray. They brought a colonel graduated from West Point. Valeriano was his name. He was with us. His name was Napoleon Valeriano, and he used the name of Vallejo. And he was very effective against the war against the Hawk in the Philippines. And the idea was to create a massive guerrilla in the Escambray Mountain. And he started by training 3 groups that comprehended the Brigade 2506. And by the way, the name 2506 comes from the first brigade member who was killed during training, and his number was 2506. Oh. So when that happened, the idea was to set up what they call the great teams, the black teams, and the occupational force. I was part of the great teams that were 19 at the time, and we were supposed to train all type of military equipment, Soviet equipment, and infiltrate Cuba before anything happens and start working with internal resistance to bring people to the Escambray Mountain. And then once that was a success, then they would bring the black teams, 25 men each, who were highly trained in maritime reception, air reception of receiving weapons, and training. So they would start training this guerrilla. And once they was strong enough, then they would bring a provisional government with the rest of the brigade and declare a government in arms, promising free election within a year. And of course, that meant that the Organization of American States was going to support us and recognize us, and it would be like 95% or more of American troops and 5% Latin American troops at the end of Castro. Now, when the president was elected, he decided to continue with the operation, but he changed the concept. First of all, he was supposed to take the city of Trinidad, who was not a bad choice, because it was a city that was near to the Escambray Mountains where they were guerrillas. There has a hospital nearby with 2,000 prisoners that already knew how to use weapons. And they had a runway that could be expanded, and it was a pretty much anti-Castro city, the city of Trinidad. And then the people didn't have disembark like they did. They have piers right in the Casilda port that they would just go into the ground directly from the boat. And now that operation still held until the 1st of April. Then, unfortunately, some advisor to the president told him that it would be very difficult to keep that from the press and that we would be involved, which is ridiculous. Nobody could believe that a group of exile will be able to amaze 5 tanks, airplanes, B-26s, over 1,000 troops with full equipment. The United States had to be behind that. But they convinced the president, and then they selected the Bay of Pigs. Now, the Bay of Pigs was an area who was secluded. It was only 2 roads of access, and the idea was to control those 2 roads of access, bring the brigade in, and within a short period of time, bring the radio station and do the same thing in a shorter period of time. Now, they didn't take in consideration the fact that we had to control the air. Now, first airstrike did take out 80%, close to 90% of Castro's Air Force. Then the last strike that was going to be taking place, that were going to be taken by 16 of our B-26s to completely eliminate Castro's forces, was stopped because they already have shot down one of our planes. And the Americans were telling the world that these were planes defecting from the Castro Air Force and attacking Cuban targets. They even brought a B-26 to Miami, and they covered up the guy, and they claimed that he was one of the Castro pilots who was defecting. The reality was that our B-26 was a little bit more modern than the Cuban B-26. It had a metal nose with the 850 caliber in the nose, and the Cuban Air Force had B-26s with plastic nose, and the machine guns were on the wings. So it came a big debate at the United Nations where Adlai Stevenson was telling the world that these were defecting planes, and Raul Roa, the guy who was the one actually representing Cuba at the time, brought the picture of our B-26 that was shot down was completely different to the Cuban plane. And then when he saw that, he was never briefed on the real situation of the operation. He told the administration, unless they put a stop to the airstrike, he will resign to the United Nations. We would have been a disaster at that point in time to have the United States ambassador to resign. So they did stop the airstrike to convince Stevenson. By that time, they were able to sink the boat that were bringing all the ammunition, all the food. They were bringing the fuel for the planes, the rocket and everything, and there was not a contingency plan. Even though we had Task Force Alpha in front of the Bay of Pigs, which had the USS carrier Essex. They had 2 submarines, 4 destroyers, and a bunch of landing craft with Marines on board ready to go. And the planes were painted in black. It didn't say U.S. Air Force or anything. But then the president apparently got cold feet, and they did not authorize the operation. Our people fought bravely for 3 days at the Bay of Pig area. When they ran out of ammunition, they did not surrender. They tried to evade, and that's when most of them were captured. So that was really that officiated and the strength of the Cuban regime after that fiasco.
A fantastic time. So fast forward, and then you're in the United States now and get your commission by President Kennedy in the late 60s at Fort Benning, Georgia, and you become a second lieutenant in the Army.
Right.
How did that feel, that time from, leaving Cuba overnight as an exile, leaving the country, revolution, and then a few years later, raising your right hand and taking an oath to the Constitution of the United States, a whole different country at age 27?
Well, I actually came to the United States to school back in 1954. I went to Perkiomen Prep in Pennsburg, Pennsylvania. Went back and forth several times to Cuba, and then, after before all of this happened, I really wanted to be an engineer. So I was accepted at the University of Miami for engineering. But then, before that, when I went to I learned there was an operation going on in the Dominican Republic when I was 17 years old. So I left the school, I went there, I only spent there a few months because it was a fiasco, it didn't work out. Came back to school, graduated, and before I went to university, I learned something was going on. That's when I went to the Bay of Pigs. But I'll tell you, it was exceptional times. After the Bay of Pigs, really, I decided I was going to quit. I got married to my present wife of 56 years. Very unusual, especially for the CIA people. And a lot of people from the agency tell me, how do you do that? I said, well, every time I was ready to fight, they pulled me in someplace else. So we never had time to fight in there. So, we had a great marriage with 2 great kids. One of them is here with me today. And I decided to completely quit, really. And I started working in a private company in Miami called Ace Letter Service, doing propaganda, and then I started working in another place called Tobin Packaging Company, which increased from $1 to $1.35 my working time. I told my wife when we got married in 1962 that I was going to quit everything, but if there was anything about Cuba, I would definitely go there. And she made the mistake of accepting that. Now, we got married 25th of August. Here comes the October crisis. So I'm working at Tobin Packaging Company. I got a call from Tom Klein from the CIA, and he told me he needed to meet me. So we met at the parking lot of the University of Miami, across from the university. I sat in his car, and he looked at me. His name was Tom Klein, and said, Felix, the Marines are going to land in Cuba, and we need you. So I looked at him and said, Tom, if the Marines are going to land in Cuba, what the hell do you need me for? He said, well, we'd like you to, you know how to operate a radio beacon. We'd like you to parachute behind a Soviet base in Santa Clara to set up this radio beacon so that our Air Force can hit with precision the air base. So at that point in time, I agreed, so they put me in a safe house, got another 2 guys to go with me. I couldn't even call my wife. She took a bus back to our apartment, and that night was when the president went on television, so I realized it was something to do with that. So my training was jumping from a table to 3 point of contact. That was my basic training from jumping. And the day we were ready to go, that's when they pulled the Khrushchev back down. That's when we were left behind. And from there on, I continued with the CIA.
Wow. Fantastic. Well, let's go back to Colonel Cole, back in on the raid. Now, I jumped out of an airplane one time. I left it over by Lebanon and Cyprus, and the taxpayers, and including all of you, paid for it. And but I was in a wetsuit, and I had a big 27-foot conical parachute, And I didn't have to do much. It automatically inflated, the life raft automatically inflated. I was talking to the helicopter rescue crew on the way down and everything else. So all in all, it was pretty benign. And I didn't miss lunch, and got back on the carrier, and everything was pretty good. Your situation was a little different, right? And so you launched in the Pacific further out than planned. So less fuel when you got over target than you had planned for. And at some point, you made the calculation, the whole crew, to bail out. How alone and unafraid were you at that time? I mean, what were you thinking about? Where were you going to land? What was the weather like? What altitude? What was the experience like?
Well, according to Colonel Doolittle's plan, we were on a heading that Hank Potter, the navigator, had given us. And to go back a little bit, his Doolittle's plan called for a low altitude approach. And in the process of lighting the airplane for more fuel space, we took out the bomb sight, which we didn't want to fall in enemy hands. And well, we did not know it that when we did so, a piece of the autopilot was taken out. So we ended up having to manhandle the airplane over the 2,300 miles at about 200 feet. As we approached Japan or China, after flying a number of hours, Potter gave us a heading and said that according to his heading that we were going to run out of fuel at about 180 miles short of China. But when we arrived at the point that he had in his plan, we still had fuel. And what had happened, a big warm front had formed over China and developed a series of other things. One of them was a tailwind, which gave us about a 30-knot tailwind. And when we arrived over the point that Hank had pointed out, we still had fuel. We arrived at China at dusk, and you could just barely see the outline of the coast. And not knowing what the terrain was like, we climbed up to 9,000 feet and resumed on the heading of that Hank had given us. The Japanese, or the Chinese, on hearing our engines, thought we were Japanese. And consequently, they turned out any kind of a light that would have helped us. Further on, they had planned to have a frequency of ADF, automatic direction finder station, at the place where we were supposed to land and gas up and fly on into western China. Well, the airplane carrying the Homer crashed on the way there. And as it ended up, we had no means of navigation in the middle of the storm. Colonel Doolittle explained to us on interphone that we would just hold the heading that Hank had given us and do the best we could. After about an hour, it was evident that we weren't going to see anything on the ground. And the gas needle was just approaching empty. He gave instructions about everybody bailing out. The rear crew chief and the rear turret guy had to bail out first. And then it was followed by the bombardier and the navigator, and then myself, and then Colonel Doolittle. Fortunately, the crew did not suffer any injuries or things.
It's unbelievable. You know, the theme I hear from what Colonel Cole and Commander from Diz and from Colonel Rodriguez is the communications part, and the Homer and the ADF and the fighter director and the beacon behind Soviet lines is phenomenal. How really, you know, planned, but the communication back and forth. But let's take the opportunity now to generate a couple of questions or two. Is this the first one over here from Firsty Hill, or you're in charge of the mic?
Yes, sir.
All right. Anybody right here in the middle, 4 rows up at 11 o'clock?
Yeah.
Good morning, gentlemen. I'm Midshipman Solomon from the Virginia Tech Corps of Cadets. My question is specifically for Commander Laird. Was your 8,000th hour as special as your first? And in addition to that, what is one piece of advice you have for those of us pursuing aviation?
Did you hear?
Didn't quite understand.
So was your 8,000th hour, was it as special as your first hour?
Oh,
And do you have advice for future aviators? Bring your hand up, sir.
I think I have to answer yes to your first question. I learned to fly when I was 19, and I was going to join the Army Air Corps along with my brother, but he needed another semester of college in order to get a commission after going through flight training. So he was still going to school. And when the war started with us, because of the Japanese attack, about that same time, I went to a movie and they had a newsreel, and on this newsreel, it showed a Navy battleship with a makeshift flight deck on it, and it showed an airplane taking off, and I thought, boy, that's kind of cool. And then it showed our first aircraft carrier, the Langley, which was a converted coal boat, and it was tooling along, and an airplane came in and made a landing on it. And I said, boy, that's got to be more fun than anything. And so when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, as soon as I could, a few days later, I got to San Francisco and joined the Navy and never looked back. I got a kick out of every time I flew, and it didn't matter. And I flew whenever I could and whatever I could. And one of my advice to young people who are going into aviation is, don't be afraid to ask for something, whatever you want. Like, I would see an airplane, I'd find out who owned it, and I'd go tell them, hey, I'd like to fly that bird. How about it? Flying it. And you'd be amazed at how many people are not mind readers, and you have to bug them, and you give them an idea, and instead of offering you to go fly their airplane, you ask them and they say, sure, why not? And that's one reason I got to fly so many airplanes. And people say, well, isn't it different? You know, you jump from a prop airplane into a jet and all the difference and thing. And my answer is, all these airplanes are the same. Doesn't matter what powers them or how many wings they have or how many engines. You get a hold of the stick like this, and you push forward and it goes down. You pull back, it goes up. And over here you got the throttle. You push forward and you go fast. You pull it back and you go slow. And it doesn't matter whether it's a jet or a prop airplane. So to me, they all flew the same. And,
All right, that's awesome. Next question, anybody? Yes, sir.
Good morning, gentlemen. Midshipman Dewar from Miami University. My question is for Colonel Rodriguez. Sir, I was reading in your bio that you had the opportunity to speak with Che Guevara after he was captured, one-on-one. I was wondering if you could share some details about what that interaction was like.
Yes, well, first of all, when we were selected to go there, the reason they selected some Cubans was because Vietnam was already taking place, and they didn't want American coming back in plastic bag. We were not citizens at the time, so we didn't have that problem. So they selected us to go there. Actually, there were 16 of us that they interviewed and selected 2 of us. And then I asked the guy, why you selected me? And the answer was, he asked me, if I select you, when will you be ready to go? And my answer to him was, well, first of all, if I have time, I'll go to my home, I'll pick up my clothes, I go back to my wife, to my 2 kids, I come back and we go. If we don't have time, I will call her from here and say, I have to go. If we don't have time, let's go, I'll give you her number, and you tell her I have to go. I guess that's impressive enough to send me. So we went down there, and we started working with the 2nd Ranger Battalion. Before they thought that Che Guevara had been killed in Africa. Now, they realized that he was there when Regis Debray, who was an intellectual from France that was captured, who was with him, then they confirmed that Che was in the area. They sent a group from Special Forces from Panama to train a 2nd Ranger Battalion. And they selected about 5 Cubans to go and advise the Bolivians in intelligence. 3 of them will be in La Paz, and 2 of us will be in the operational area. Now, we will start following him. We finally were able to get intelligence, specifically the way he was moving. But we go to that day that you're interested in. My instruction from the CIA was to try to keep him alive at all costs. And the reason was they have learned that he was pro-Chinese, and Cuba depended solely on the Soviet Union, which meant that he was not being supported by Castro at all. His transmitter, when he arrived, was broken. The head of the Communist Party, when he got there, Mario Monge, actually told the guerrillas that were with him from the Communist Party, if they continue to stay there, they will fire from the Communist Party. And they took out the individual who was in charge of helping him out of La Paz. So he was all by himself. I consider him really the worst guerrilla in the world. He was not even able to recruit a single farmer in close to a year of operation in the operational area. So when we first arrived in there, we learned it was October the 8th, was a Sunday, 1967. I was setting up some PRC-10 radios on 3 aircraft that they have, who didn't have communication ground to air. And we received the news that Papa Cansado, which meant that the leader of the guerrilla was captured and alive. Now, we didn't know whether it was Che Guevara or whether it was Inti Peredo, the leader of the guerrilla on the Bolivian side. So I flew in the back of one of the 86s, and Major Serrate, the head of operation, in the back of the other one. We confirmed that indeed was the foreigner. So we go into the area, the operational area. When we got into the room where he was in a schoolhouse with dirt floor, very dark. In the back of the room were the dead body of 2 Cubans, Captain also Pantoja, who was in charge of training in Cuba for foreigners, and another Cuban captain who had been killed. So when I came in with Colonel Centeno Naya, the head of the division, and a couple of other officers, he started asking Che questions. He wouldn't say anything, nothing. He would not even answer him. So the colonel told him, said, look, you're a foreigner. You have invaded my country. The least you can do is have the courtesy of answering me. He didn't say a word, so we left. So I asked the colonel if I could get all his documentation to photograph it for my government. He gave it to me, and I started photographing it. Then while I was there, I received a phone call. At that time, they had a phone call at Higuera, and they asked for the highest ranking officer. I had the rank of captain at the time, and there was only 2 lieutenants in the area. So the order was 500, 600. The small, simple code that we had was 500 share, 600 kill, 700 keep him alive. So we knew, the order to be killed. So when Centeno came back before he left, I called him aside and said, "Mi Coronel, this order from your high Bolivian command to eliminate the prisoner. The order from my government is try to keep him alive at all costs, and we have helicopter on plane to send him to Panama for interrogation." My name was Felix Ramos. So he said, "Look, Felix, we have worked empirically. We're very grateful to you, but this is order from my president, my commander-in-chief." So he looked at his watch and said, "The helicopter is going to come several times, bringing food and ammunition and taking our wounded and our dead. He's going to come back at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You can justiciate him any way you want, because we know how much harm you've done to your country." And I said, "Mi Coronel, try to make them change their mind, but it's not changing order. I'll give you my word, I'll bring you back the dead body of Che." We embraced and he left. So I started waiting to see what happened. But then the helicopter came, they came with a camera, that's the picture that was taken with me and himself. And then there was a lady who came where I was, saying, mi Capitan, why are you going to kill him?" I said, "Why do you say that?" I said, "Well, we saw you being photographed with him out there, and look, the radio is already giving the news that he died in combat wounds." So at that point in time, I knew there was nothing else to wait. So I went into the room, I stood in front of him and said, "Commander, I'm sorry. I tried my best." That's all I said. He turned perfectly what I was saying. He turned white like a piece of paper. He said, "It's better this way. I should have never been captured alive." Then he put out the pipe and said, "I'd like to give the pipe to a soldadito who treated me well." And at that point in time, Mario Teran, who was the sergeant who was killing everybody in the area, burst into the room. "Yo quiero la pipa, mi capitán, I want the pipe." And said, "Che, no, a ti no te la doy." So I ordered him twice to leave the room, and he did. So when we were there alone, I asked, say, "Commander, will you give it to me?" He looked at me for a few seconds and said, "A ti si te la doy." He gave me the pipe, I put it here. He says, "Anything for your family you want to send to them." So I would say in a sarcastic way, he said, "Well, if you can't tell Fidel, he will soon see a triumphant revolution in America," which meant, you abandon me, but this is going to be successful anyway. And then he said, "If you can't tell my wife to remarry and try to be happy." That was his last word. He approached me, we shook hands, and we embraced. And I tell you, it's a very difficult situation for me as a military man, as an agency guy, to have to order the execution of a prisoner. Before I even thought about calling the landline and tell the pilot when he arrived that my government was able to convince his government to bring Che alive. And then I thought to myself, what happened when Batista released Fidel Castro and all the harm that have come to my country. So I felt I was there to advise, not to command. It was their decision, and I thought history followed himself. So I didn't do anything else to try to save his life. So I came out of the room, and there was Sergeant Teran sitting out there. I said, "Sargento, don't shoot from here up. Shoot from here down. He's supposed to die from combat wounds." "Sí, mi capitán." And I left. And it was 1 o'clock when I left there, 1:15 when I heard the burst. That was the time when he was killed. And looking back today, I think probably was the best thing that happened. If he had been released, even though they create a myth about him, he would have gone to another country, and a lot of more bloodshed would have been spilled all over Latin America.
Wow. All right, everybody. Well, thank you for your questions. Our time is at an end here. And Colonel Rodriguez, Commander Laird, Colonel Cole, I think we can all agree that we are fortunate that you were born when you were, and you were mentally and physically ready to pick up this nation's calling in the 20th century. And I, for one, cannot sit here in so much awe. So I'm going to stand and honor your service and your lives. So thank you very much, sir. We'll come get you, sir. We'll come get you.